here, and we are delighted to have this partnership with the bookstore. So, and we hope that while you are here, you will kind of roam around if you get a chance. We're putting up a new exhibit now. It's not quite up, but it is Polly Forcier's lifetime stenciling work, which is really quite remarkable. And it will be fully up and running by the time of our House and Garden Tour, which is my other plug. That's on the 25th, the week from Saturday. We're going to have artists, plein air artists, painting at the properties, and I think it will be really a lot of fun. So, those are all the plugs for the Historical Society. Now I'll give you over to the real history.
Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Alan Berolsheimer. And I wear a couple of different hats in regards to this event. I am the managing editor for the Vermont Historical Society and have had the pleasure of working with Sara on this book for about the last year and a half. Oh. Well, in this incarnation.
Yes, right.
Sara will tell you the whole story of how this book came to be, which is a lot lengthier than a year and a half. But it's about the last year and a half or so that we've been working to get this book published to tell this story. I'm also on the board of the Norwich Historical Society, and I live here in town. And so when we, at the Vermont Historical Society, when we decided with Sara that she was interested in coming out and spending a week in Vermont and doing some events, she's going to be at the Vermont History Expo this weekend, for example, I thought, let's do an event with the Norwich Bookstore and the Norwich Historical Society. And I'm particularly thrilled to be able to have an event in Norwich because there's a really significant Norwich connection to this story. So Achsa Sprague was born and raised in Plymouth, Vermont, which is not too far from here, and I imagine many of you have been to Plymouth.
Plymouth Notch.
Plymouth Notch. Plymouth Notch,
Yes.
important distinction.
Yes.
Who's in the book?
But somewhere, maybe, I don't know, somewhere in the process of working on the book in the last year and a half, Sara made it clear to me that this book of Achsa Sprague's, it's a play in verse and other poems that was published after she died, that the man who took it upon himself to get this book published was none other than Merritt Goddard. Those of you who know anything about Norwich history know that Merritt Goddard was the man who wrote the history of Norwich that the town published in 1905. And how many years ago was it that we published our updated Norwich history? 4 years ago now?
Yeah.
20, I think it was December 2012. When Elizabeth was part of that group, I was part of that group who wrote that updated Norwich history. And of course, we relied very heavily on this book. So I feel like I have a special connection with Merritt Goddard. There's a picture of him in case anybody is interested in that.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Yeah, there's Merritt right there. This comes out of the history of Reading.
Okay.
So Merritt Goddard was born in Reading, Vermont, attended Dartmouth College, went to Harvard to be a divinity student, and actually never finished his degree because of some health issues stemming from an accident he'd suffered as a child. But he represented Reading in the legislature for a couple of terms. He was on the Reading School Board. He moved from Reading to Norwich about 1875 and was on the Windsor County School Board, the Windsor County School Supervisors, Board of School Supervisors. And as a youth in college, he attended Achsa Sprague's very first public lecture.
In South Reading.
In South Reading. Became captivated by her, followed her career, and when she died, he decided that he wanted to publish this last work of hers that she'd written in about the last 6 weeks before she died. So anyway, for those reasons, it's just particularly thrilling for me that we can have an event here in Norwich and honor Merritt Goddard as well as Achsa Sprague. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Sara Rath. Please welcome her to Norwich.
Actually, what Merritt Goddard said in a letter to Achsa later on was he went to hear her speak because of the unusual nature of having a woman preach, and he thought perhaps it would be a laughable thing. But instead he went home to pray because he was so moved by what she said. And he wrote to her several times after that. He was a real sturdy friend and loyal friend. Can you see okay?
Yep.
Okay. Good. Now I screwed up the TV camera. I brought something along because I wanted to show you, this book is based, it's called historical fiction. And Alan knows this because there were some leaps of faith. As I mentioned in a blog entry that I did, when you do a biography, it's like you have all these pieces of a puzzle to put together, and there are bound to be some pieces that are missing. And so you have to sort of mentally meditate and try and figure out what would fit in that area. And so you read the letters, you read the diaries, you read the newspaper articles that deal with that period of time, and you put together something that you hope is going to be accurate. And what I did when I went through the 1,000 letters, I better start something else. I learned about Achsa Sprague when I was at the Lilydale Assembly, which is a spiritualist colony down upstate New York, and someone loaned me a book and I read about her, and the footnote said that her diaries and letters were in the archives of the Vermont Historical Society. And immediately I wondered, why has no one written about this? Because they were the only existing diary and letters of an American spiritualist medium. Well, here I was at a spiritualist assembly listening to mediums do their thing, and I had taken a couple classes because I'm a very inquisitive person, and I wanted to learn how it was that they did this. And so I had, my MFA is from Vermont College in Montpelier. I taught at Goddard for a while, so I was familiar with Vermont, and thought, this has fallen in my lap. I really am meant to write this book, because she was also a poet, she was a social activist, she was an abolitionist, she was a feminist, she was a person who wanted to make something of her life, and yet she was born in a small town, and there were very few opportunities available for her. Last night I spoke at the Athenaeum in St Johnsbury, and there were 6 people there, including 2 librarians, my husband, my son, a woman who left immediately afterward, and another woman who was a heavy-set woman, which is they always say about women. They never say the man was heavy-set, right? She was a heavy-set woman, and she had a companion dog with her, a sausage-like chihuahua named Blondie. That was my audience last night. So you have already warmed my heart beyond imagination. Anyway, what I did was I took the articles in the newspapers, and I took the letters, and I made timelines for the major characters. For Achsa, for her sister Celia, who in this version of the manuscript tells the story, and for John Crawford, who eventually becomes Achsa's lover. So you might see on any particular date where she was, what the letters to her said, what she might, a note of what she might have written in her diary at that time. So I got a sense of where she was and what was happening and what her mindset was at that particular time. For example, the World's paper from February 12, 1858, Miss A.W. Sprague has spoken in Windsor County for the last few weeks, having spoken at Tyson on the 30th, at South Reading on the 7th, and will speak at Pomfret on the 14th, at Heartland the 21st, and Burlington the 28th, and so forth and so on. She really got around, and I don't know if it was entirely by train, because I don't know what the railroad situation was in Vermont at that time, but she did a lot of travel by stagecoach, which I think would have been horrible. And in winter, she went by sleigh and froze. Well, I'll start over because I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how my process went, because people seem to be intrigued by how I put together the diaries and the letters and made a story out of it. And this book draws very heavily on true information, except for the places where I had to fill in the blanks. But I had the sense that I captured the essence of what it was. So the Achsa Sprague papers held by the Vermont Historical Society are the only extant personal papers of a 19th century spiritualist medium. When I went through the archives, I found over 1,000 letters written to her, plus files of miscellany with no attributions, which I soon determined were drafts of letters, poems, stories, or automatic writing. My interest was piqued like you wouldn't believe, yet I knew the task ahead was enormously daunting. She was born on November 17, 1827, in the small hamlet of Plymouth Notch in Vermont's Green Mountains. A brilliant, well-read child, she began teaching at the local school at the age of 12. Well, I think it was like helping the teacher.
Yeah.
But one of her elementary students, John Coolidge, would eventually have a son named Calvin. And somehow they were distantly related. And if you go through the Plymouth Notch Cemetery, you notice there's some Sprague Coolidge plots. But I didn't go to Ancestry.com to figure them out. The Coolidge family graves are only steps away from those of the Spragues in the modest cemetery. And as you know, the entire community is completely unchanged, virtually unchanged, from the way it was during the childhood of our 30th president, and it is a National Historic Landmark. And last Sunday, we were present for the inauguration of a historical marker on the homestead of Achsa Sprague, which was very exciting after all of our efforts. And Bill Jenny, who's the historian in charge of the Coolidge Foundation, was instrumental in that, but we had looked forward to doing that for many, many years. This book, I first read the footnote about Achsa Sprague in 1998, so I've lived with her for a long time. During her brief lifetime, Achsa, who was known to her family and friends as Axie, became one of the best-known women in Vermont and east of the Mississippi. She had a newspaper column called Notes by the Wayside, in which she petitioned for equal rights for women and agitated for other social reforms. She pressed for the abolition of slavery and strongly appealed for changes to the penal system. Her many poems and children's stories, widely published, were signed Solitary or Belle. And I think Belle probably came from the fact that Charlotte Bronte, whose novel had come out in 1842 and she adored, Charlotte signed her poems Belle. So that may have been an homage to Charlotte Bronte. But I couldn't find anything about that. Achsa Sprague was best known as a medium who sang hymns or recited poems or delivered messages of hope and comfort as guardian angels spoke through her while she was on stage in a self-induced trance. At the age of 20, she had been afflicted with a scrofulous disease that confined her to bed in a darkened room for nearly 5 years, like a prisoner in a dungeon, as she described it in early poems that mourned her lost hopes. She really wanted to go on and get further education and learn. She was just hungry for learning. She could no longer teach. Even holding a pen was painful. And with unleashed anger, she raged aloud to God. Her gradual recovery, she said, began in November 1852, when her impassioned appeals were interrupted by the blinding rush of angels' wings. These guardian angels exacted a promise for her restoration to health. She must take up a holy mission to turn souls from sins to nobler truths and to explain that the soul does not die. Spiritualists believe that there are different levels of existence, and after you die, you go up to a higher level, and that we can communicate with those spirits, and they can communicate with us. And that's the spiritualism aspect, and it's still a religion. Sunday, I am speaking at the, I don't know the name of the church. There's a church south of Woodstock. Healing and Spiritual something, it's a long name. I get to speak before the mediums deliver their messages. That'll be pretty cool. So, within a year of regaining her health, she was on her own as a trance-speaking medium. Personal revelations of her miraculous restoration by spirit power were in demand and endeared her to followers of modern spiritualism, a loosely organized movement that began in America shortly before 1850. She began her odyssey in spiritual gatherings throughout Vermont. Before long, she was traveling alone by railroad, stagecoach, and steamboat throughout New England and eventually as far west as Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Davenport, Iowa, St. Louis, Memphis, Terre Haute, just before the Civil War began. So things were very iffy, especially Memphis, because Tennessee was a slave state. And she didn't know what the spirits were going to have her say when she was entranced. She was afraid she might blurt out something about abolition and get in big trouble, but apparently she didn't because she got out of there without being hanged. Is it hanged or hung? Hanged. That's what I always say. Hanged, but I always see hung in the in the papers. It's wrong, isn't it? Yeah, I know. Hanged. I've always said hanged. She got out of Tennessee okay. All right. It was scandalous for a woman to appear alone on stage. The newspapers both praised and scorned her appearances, but she was constantly being tested. In fact, the Oswego Times in upstate New York newspaper said, "Why is it all the world should run nightly mad to hear her improvise a hymn from a subject selected at random, a hymn that nobody else ever wrote or sung, for the very good reason that it was not worth the while." The Milwaukee Sentinel reported, "To the honest listener who went with the desire of learning something, it was profound twaddle from beginning to end. We were disappointed at the outset, for we knew that the magic of a woman's tongue is scarcely effective with a mixed audience unless there is the important adjunct of personal beauty, and she is not by any means a prepossessing young lady." Well, I decided after many iterations of this manuscript, as Alan is aware, that I wanted to tell the story from the point of view of her sister Celia for several reasons, because I wanted somebody to tell a story who would not be entirely overwhelmed and amazed by her gifts. I wanted somebody who could be critical. Sisters are that way. And somebody who would see her from an objective point of view. And there were many letters from Celia in this box of letters that were in the Historical Society, still there. I hired a work-study student to copy them for me, and it took me a year to transcribe them, and I will give the typewritten versions to the Historical Society. I knew there was a story there, and I was especially taken by her picture, which is on the cover of my book, because it looked like she had something to say. And when my work-study student said to me, "I just want to tell you that all letters from John Crawford are in blue stationery." Well, they were all white to me because I had received Xerox copies. I took those all out and I put them in chronological order, and oh my God, there was a love story there. And John Crawford was quite a bit older than she. He had 5 children. He had a wife. He was part owner in a huge corporation that owned 18 propeller-driven ships from Ogdensburg, New York, to Chicago and Milwaukee with materials and took them back again. One of the things they hauled was salt. And they also hauled passengers occasionally, and it was very luxurious. I actually took a trip on one of the ships and very detailed description of what the ships were like. So I thought, well, that makes a book, because otherwise it would have been a historical story about a woman who's a medium, but a woman who's a medium and indulged in free love, which is what the spiritualists were pushing at the time. The big deal spiritualists were pushing free love. Now that meant You could have a physical relationship, if you were a woman, with a man who was a spiritualist, but it was your spirits that were having the relationship. You had to take no responsibility for that. The newspapers called this free lust and made a big deal out of it and put down the spiritualists and said this is really horrible. And Achsa felt it was terrible too. She dreaded, they had like Q&A after her lectures. That was one of her trademarks. And she always dreaded somebody asking her about how she felt about free love because she was so much against it. And then she struggled mightily with this relationship with this man whom she grew to love very deeply. Tonight I'm going to read something that I've never read at a reading, and it's not typed out it's just all scribbled. So I hope I don't stumble too much, but it's in the beginning of the book, and then the rest of the book is sort of a flashback. This is when Celia comes to see Achsa because her mother says Achsa is dying. So she comes from Wisconsin to spend some time with her. As originally pledged, my purpose with this story, I could call it my intended pursuit. Now this is Celia speaking, okay? She's married, living in Wisconsin on a farm. She was a school teacher. But of course, once you got married, you couldn't teach school, which I don't quite understand. I guess you just sort of tainted the children if you were married. Okay. As originally pledged, my purpose with this story, I could call it my intended pursuit, is to describe my sister Achsa's inspired life. Through the years, I've kept a scrapbook where I pasted newspaper notices of Achsa's appearances, correspondence from Mother, including Achsa's letters to her, and those essays and stories written by my sister that I have been able to collect. Of course, Achsa's letters to me are tucked in there as well. I've lived here in Wisconsin for nearly a decade. I've married a good and kind man born in Ireland, John Morrison Steen, and we live on his farm near Oakfield, where he has built me a house and fashioned many fine pieces of furniture. He is a free thinker, not a Catholic, a farmer and carpenter and well-read. Our blessed country is currently at war. This is 1862. Our blessed country is currently at war, and circumstances nearly everywhere are wretched. Only a few short months ago, I paid my final visit to my beloved sister at our childhood home in the Notch. Our weather was overly warm for June as I boarded the cars for Vermont. With each stop as I traveled east, I witnessed groups of young, enthusiastic boys who are eager to fill up the ranks and make food for powder, as my husband would say. All in all, my recent departure from our farm this summer involved a sad journey, and for many reasons, an even more desolate voyage back home to our farm. Unlike Achsa, I have never relished traveling by myself and find the train cars deafening, crowding, and reeking with unpleasant odors. My dove gray journeying dress is filthy with ash and reeks of smoke. It should be destroyed. Recompense for my train fare east involves sacrifice for Morris, as economic times have been difficult. Over 40 banks in Wisconsin have already failed, and more are expected to fail every day. But my husband insisted that I must go where I was needed. I kept Mother's telegram tucked in my bodice. Come at once, Achsa near death. After 2 days of miserable railroad travel, I caught the stagecoach at Ludlow, and last and none too soon we reached the heart of Plymouth Union. There was the familiar balm of Gilead tree in front of Daniel Wilder's hotel. The horses made a sharp right turn and were reined to a stop, while the driver handed the mail to the storekeeper, and the pause allowed the horses to catch their breath before the steep climb up to the Notch. My little hamlet seemed unusually desolate. Of course, the boys from the Notch, lovers of true freedom, would have been among the first brave and loyal hearts to volunteer their lives at the shrine of liberty. When Fort Sumter was fired upon, Vermont offered troops to President Lincoln even before Congress passed a declaration of war. I'd been told that every Vermont soldier wore a distinctive green patch upon his cap to proudly denote his Green Mountain origin. Within minutes of climbing the hill, I arrived at our farmhouse, only to find my near-death sister very much alive and, albeit weak, in a frenzied and animated state. The day before, she and Mother had returned home from a 20-mile passage over the mountains to Rutland, thanks to Axie's insistent marshalling of Uncle Thomas and his carriage. After a brief hug and a fluttering motion of her hands, a frenetic nervousness most unlike her, my sister paced the floor of our mother's parlor in an agitated manner. I found her appearance as bewildering as her actions. Axie's face was partially covered with a dish towel tied around her head, seemingly a sort of bandage for her left eye. The other eye was sunken deep into her skull, but possessed a restive gaze. She was emaciated beyond even her sickest days as a child, and her visage, that I was able to observe, bore an unhealthy pallor. Words spilled from her almost more swiftly than I could comprehend. Moreover, her garments were extremely ill-fitting. In the heat of the afternoon, she clasped a deep green velvet cloak. It was so large it dragged on the floor, yet she shivered with chills. "You must join me in a stroll," she whispered almost immediately. "I have an urgent need to confide in my beloved sister." I exchanged a quick glance with Mother, who waved a weary hand behind Axe's back to signal that I comply. I longed for a bath and a restorative nap after my journey, but Axie's welfare was my objective. "My own green mountains," Axie sang with a tremulous voice as we departed our familiar dooryard. One fragile arm was locked in mine, but the other flailed hysterically like an anxious bird. "I am so grateful to at last be secure within the folds of their embrace, and in yours as well, my dearest, sweetest, most beloved Cecilia." She leaned over to kiss my cheek with chapped lips so hot, I unconsciously brought my free hand there, fearing her kiss had left a mark. Our pace was exceedingly slow. There were no neighbors about, yet Axie pulled the hood of the velvet cape over her head to conceal her tortured features. I heard a feverish ecstasy in the words she uttered the moment we were beyond our mother's hearing. "Celia, I believe I am with child." The statement seemed so unlikely I gasped and covered my mouth. The grip on my arm tightened. Her face bore a rictus grin. "I was forced to flee in haste from Oswego. I will tell you all about it in detail tomorrow. Oh, Celia, it became such an ungodly mess with Mr. Crawford's wife, Elvira, who I sincerely believe is my friend, or was until I fled. I became trapped in that city. I had no choice but to endure my recovery, such as it was, under their roof for nearly a year. And then yesterday, I knew of Mr. Crawford's long-planned meeting with the railroad in Rutland. Hence, I begged Uncle Thomas to hasten me there so I could reveal our glorious news. As it happened, Mr. Crawford, John, was not at the hotel after all. Perhaps he had never even come. But his associate, Mr. Philo Chamberlain, had left an envelope for me that contained a very special poem. And oh, such a poem, dear sister. I may have sometimes doubted my darling John's love, but I am now assured of it with all my heart. I could barely apprehend her scurried jumble of words. My sister seemed possessed. She pulled a creased blue envelope from her sleeve and clutched it to her heart. "I will carry this with me until death." We had reached the church that stood down the hill below our house. After only a moment, Axie pulled me inside his wide doors before we might be seen. "Mother warned me it was foolhardy to journey to Oswego last year. As you know, I had been ill, and due to my illness, I canceled a full slate of summer lectures in the West." Her comments continued with ecstatic rapidity. "When I reached Oswego with the sole intention of attending the National Convention of Spiritualists and greeting all my colleagues who were equally anxious for my presence, I found I was too unwell to appear and became obliged to depend on friends for my convalescence. And of course, as my health failed, Mr. Crawford would have me stay at his home on the shores of Lake Ontario. He was most insistent, Celia. There was no refusing him. He carried me there in his arms. Even if he had known my recuperation would last through winter, he would not have reconsidered for one moment. You have no idea how charming he is, and how commanding. And what would happen, did happen, of course. I fumbled for a seat in a box pew, fearing I was close to collapse. Axie still clutched my hand in a fierce knot. It was a spiritual relationship, Celia. You must believe me. After speaking out against it as stridently as I did across this country, north, south, east, west, I could never hold with acknowledging to anyone but you, dear Celia, that your sister, Achsa Sprague, engaged in free love. You must realize my guardians and his were profoundly invested in our devotion. We were sincerely convinced of that. In Pope's essay on man, he says, whatever is right, and John and I relied earnestly upon that phrase. And oh, Celia, the bliss and the agonies we suffered. My sister tore her hand away, and leaning on the edges of pews for support, made her unsteady way to the front of the church, where she threw back the hood of her velvet cape and paced back and forth before the altar. I could now see that her hair had been shorn. She ran her pitifully thin fingers through the matted curls, tugging angrily at her scalp. The night before I escaped from Lakeside View, yes, I had to escape from John's home. In due course it came to that. I played with various phrases until my fingers bled. Finally my quill captured the precise mix of my bitterness and sorrow. I dressed before my maid awoke and tiptoed downstairs at dawn, where I placed the letter and a poem from Mrs. Crawford on the silver tray with her silver coffee service, along with $6 from my purse. $6, the total sum of my income for 9 months. If you care to read the letter, Celia, I have an early draft. Her voice now conveyed a shrill and peculiar air of peril. At that early hour, she gestured dramatically with both arms, a perfect glissade of fog fanned out from Lake Ontario. Like a phantom pursued, I crossed the lawn from the house to the barn, the lively waves mocking me as they shattered invisibly upon nearby rocks. The dew was so heavy that morning that it soaked through my new kid boots. I had entrusted the little Irish boy who looks after the Crawford stable to be prepared with the black team harnessed and my trunks already in the carriage. I knew Mr. Crawford would return from Ogdensburg on the steamer Prairie State before noon. I desperately wished to avoid saying farewell. As for Elvira, when she discovered the note and grasped the meaning of my poem, I was certain she would remain in her bedchamber for most of the day. What did you say in the letter? I asked at last. Why would Mrs. Crawford be so singularly upset? Because the poem referred to hearts tempted into sin and deep despair and even the sufferer's aching eye, my eye. My recuperation at Lakeside View had evolved into the inevitable chaos one would expect. There my sister paused and untied the linen from her head to wipe a flood of tears from her good eye. With her ragged hair and the formerly bandaged eye protruding from her face in an extremely hideous and gruesome manner, I could not but turn away and cover my own eyes, even as I heard my grasp of horror. When to thy heart and to thy home thy words have bid the wanderer come, and watch with earnest heartfelt prayer and with a mother's tender care. There's no doubt Elvira would have recognized herself. When hearts are tempted into sin, if thou dost speak their souls to win from that dark midnight gulf of pain, making them strong and true again, when wildly by the storms they're driven. She stood at the pulpit and quoted the entire poem, which seemed to request forgiveness at the same time she admitted her own forbidden love. Free love, a spiritualist practice my sister had preached against from New England to beyond the Mississippi River. Free love that was scorned by skeptics who cruelly christened it free lust. My dearest beloved Axie looked and sounded like the madwoman I feared she had become. Do you have any questions? Yes.
So you only had letters to her, or were there letters from
She
her?
did have drafts of letters that she wrote to other people. And occasionally there were words crossed out, there were things written in the margins. She apparently wanted the letters to be exactly as she wished them to be, and was very particular in choosing just the right words. And there were drafts of letters to John Crawford, as well as to other people, some who had written to her criticizing her work. So I was able to get a sense of her speech, her way of writing. And she had all of these columns, which were written, newspaper columns, were written in first person. So that was another way to get to know her very closely.
How did you know that that this is the only extant collection for immediate after Spiritualist?
The only extent
You said
diaries.
Just out
Well,
of curiosity.
the persons who had written the book in which I read the note was the head of the Women's Studies Department at the Harvard Theological School. And she had done a very in-depth study of women in religion in the 19th century. And she had been to Plymouth Knot, she had gone through the files. And when I wrote to her and said I was thinking of writing this book, she said, "I'm so excited because Achsa Sprague really needs to have a book written about her." If there were another, I would be happy to read it. Yes.
I have two questions. Are the letters reproduced in the book?
Yes,
Book? They are.
yes.
Okay. And the other second question.
Some of the letters, not 1,000.
Yeah. Right. Are you familiar with the Grimsky sisters?
Yes.
From Two Monk Kids book?
Yes, yes.
Well, they were around the mid 1800s, I think.
Yes. But I don't think they kept diaries that she quoted from.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
You know, and some of that book is fiction.
Yeah.
But I did go to the Brooklyn Museum to see the table. There is a table of women, and each one has a plate. These are women who have done significant things throughout these 2 centuries.
The dinner party.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who was the Judith?
Judy Chicago.
Oh, those are wild plates.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It was at the Brooklyn Museum,
Yeah.
and there was and I found out about it when I read the book, and I read the afterword of how she did that too. She had seen the exhibit and then went and investigated and found out more about
them.
the family.
There were some very interesting women in the 19th century who really deserve more attention. And a lot of times they don't get the attention because their lives were not exciting enough for a contemporary audience or something.
Or they were women.
Yeah.
Yes, very good point. Yes, they were women, right.
Were there other spiritualists who you came?
Oh yes, there were a lot of women spiritualists at Achsa's time, and because women were thought to be more competent as mediums because they were more sensitive. So they could achieve the communication with the spirit world more easily than men. But there were also men. The big leaders were men. The big leaders who were very much in favor of free love were men. Wonder why. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so how big a movement was spiritualism around that time? I mean, compared to, say, other religions, and did it have any particular adherents either in parts of the country or among certain classes of people, or, I mean...
That's a good question.
There was a big community in Boston, right?
There was a what?
Big community in Boston.
Yes, there was also Brook Farm, which was, they tried some of these utopian communities too, which didn't last. Well, there's this whole area that was called the Burned Over District, and there were these waves of religious fervor that passed across the area. And frequently it was the women who went to the revival meetings. There would be the Shakers, and then everybody would want to be a Shaker. Then there would be the Methodists, and everybody wanted to be a Methodist. Seventh-day Adventists, everybody would want to be a Seventh. Then the Spiritualists, or the Mormons, or there were waves of them that came through year after year. And spiritualism hung on, and there still are spiritualist churches. There's a spiritualist camp in Wisconsin that was organized in 1894, and it's still going strong. You can go there and rent a cabin and some of the cabins have mediums in them. Lilydale is particularly interesting if you have any interest in it. It's a whole little village that is populated by mediums, and the little Victorian cottages are built on tent platforms, and it's like Chautauqua's Poor Sister, if you've ever been to the Chautauqua. Well, Lilydale is down quite a few pegs. It's a little more rustic and worn, but there'll be a sign in the window that says the medium is in, just like Lucy in Charlie Brown. And you can make an appointment, and she will do a reading for you and tell you about someone who has passed on who has a message for you. They have a place at Lilydale called Inspiration Stump with a lot of, I love the name, and where you sit on these like picnic table benches, and then a medium stands in front and she points to different people in the audience and gives them messages. There's also the Forest Temple. There's also the auditorium. It's just a fascinating place. I can't say enough about it. It's a really interesting place, and they offer workshops. I took a class in personal development of mediumship, just purely out of curiosity, and I wanted to sit in the back of the room and make notes. And the medium teaching the class, Rose Clifford, was from England. And she said, come up, come up, come up. Nobody just sits in the back and thinks, you must participate. Well, that was the furthest thing from my mind. But I had to participate. I had to learn how you deliver a message. I had to learn how you do something like take something from this tray of belongings that everybody's put something on the tray and meditate on it, and then say what it says about the person to whom the object belongs. And I was really good at it. And wow, I thought, well, you know, if writing doesn't pay, I can always put a sign in the window that says the medium is in. So yes, spiritualism still exists, and there are spiritualist churches, as I said. There's one, I can't think of the name of the
It's in
town.
Heartland.
Heartland, okay.
Church
good.
of Light, maybe is what
It's
it's
Church
called.
of Light and Spiritualist Healing, something like that, yes.
I think, Jane, there were lots of small circles of people who got together and attempted to
Sure.
communicate or be with a medium, but it wasn't like it was a church and people were going to services on Sunday
not that.
as spiritualists. But if you read the book and you read, you know, the newspaper stories and things, hundreds, if not 1,000 or more people would come out to hear.
Yes.
Actually, people like her,
Yes.
you know, do a performance or a, you know, a transmission or whatever you want to call it.
I think it was
So-
popular for people to get together for what they would call a circle. And that would be like a seance. And they would sit at a table, their hands on the table, and the table might tip. And if it tipped after somebody asked a question, that meant you got an answer. Now this all came from the fact of the Fox sisters, and I can't think of the date right offhand, but it was
I think it's in the 1840s.
Hyattsville, New York, yes, the 1840s.
Mid-1840s.
And these two sisters, Margaretta and Catherine Fox, claimed that they heard rappings when they were in bed at night. Jay, correct me if I'm wrong on this, okay? And it was discovered that the rappings came from the body of a peddler whose body was found buried in the basement of the house along with his peddler's box, which is at Lilydale. You can see it is charred because the house burned down. But I touched it, actually. I touched it. And they thought the peddler was delivering messages through the girls. And Catherine and Margaret Fox became very famous. Horace Greeley took a liking to them. He was a newspaper man in New York. They went to New York, they gave seances, they spoke all over, and they became very, very widely known. And the rappings became the thing, and people listened for rappings that would spell out the alphabet. And Woodstock was a real hotbed of spiritualism when Achsa was getting involved with the spiritualist world after her illness. And someone in Woodstock invented this machine that sounds like it was like a typewriter. And I learned about this at the Woodstock Historical Society because someone had kept a diary about it. And they contacted the spirit of George Washington, who told them which letter to pound out on this machine. And they published a pamphlet of George Washington speaking about some bizarre subject. I don't remember what it is. I think it's in the book, right? He knows everything that's in the book, nothing better than I do at this point. So, so it was something that Achsa became familiar with because of what was happening in her area. That doesn't answer your question very well.
Oh, it did.
Okay.
It did answer the question very well.
I'm sorry, I've lived with this material for so long that when you ask me a simple question,
Wasn't Conan Doyle a spiritualist?
ooh, he tried to disprove it.
Ah.
Actually, my son can tell you more about that.
No, Conan Doyle's didn't disprove it.
Oh,
Houdini
that
tried.
was Houdini who tried to disprove
Disprove
it. Yes.
Because Conan Doyle believed in fairies.
That's what happens when you're Irish. And William Butler Yeats's wife, George, was a spiritualist.
Oh, she was. I didn't know
Absolutely.
that.
Huge.
Oh.
It's massive in Ireland.
I had
Massive.
no idea. Oh, I love Yeats. Well, tell us about Conan Doyle.
Yeah, I did believe in fairies. There's spirit photography was big right after World War One. After World War I, spiritualism really took off in Great Britain because they'd lost a generation of young men, and they wanted to communicate with those who passed beyond. So spiritualism already existed, but it really escalated in Great Britain, and it took a number of different paths. One very scientific, and they tried to conduct experiments and everything. But yes, Conan Doyle was very involved in it. He was a big supporter. Coincidentally, one of his sons had passed, and he believed that they were in communication. There was spirit photography, and also some children took photos in Great Britain of fairies in their garden, supposedly. And it was thought, you know, these children, how could they fake a photograph? And photos were still relatively new. And later on, toward the end of their lives, they admitted that they'd faked the photos. But Conan Doyle was a very big supporter. And Houdini, at the time, made it a personal mission to disprove so-called mediums or spiritualists because they were, in most cases, defrauding the public.
And he was not.
Yes, he wanted to. They were using stage magicians' tricks to convince people to give them lots of money. So he would disguise himself, go into these seances where people were supposed to be paying a lot of money to hear Uncle Chester, and expose them and write about it in newspapers.
Thank you. It's so helpful to have someone like that in the family.
Do you have a new project?
Oh, I have written a series of novels about northern Wisconsin because I'm from Wisconsin. And I usually take an environmental bent, and it's something that I'm against, but I feel that I can make a bigger point of it if I fictionalize it, because people are more apt to read fiction than an outright, I'm against hunting for wolves, or you shouldn't bait bears, you shouldn't use dogs for bear hunting, which I'm very much against. And so I have done that in a couple of books, and I have a third one that's coming up. It really has to come up because my fans really, they're cozy mysteries. They're, you know, this book was really hard, and I've done some really hard books with footnotes and dates, and oh my God, it's just, it's really exhausting. And so it's so fun just to sit down at my computer and make stuff up in my head. And make up characters that make people laugh and sometimes make people mad. I don't like wolf hunting. We have a lot of wolves in Wisconsin. And the hunters claim the wolves get the deer and that they don't have, the deer hunting has gone down. We found that bobcats frequently kill a deer and they go right for the heart and clean the heart out. If a wolf got a deer, they eat the entire carcass. They don't leave anything behind. And I've done a lot of research on that. I've gone on several wolf howls in the middle of the night in the Chequamegon National Forest with a man from the DNR and my husband also, and who was in charge of the wolf population in Wisconsin. We never heard a wolf howl, although I learned how to howl like a wolf, so they try and get him to answer me. I pray, please answer me. Just a cool thing to have a wolf answer me, but never did. But we've heard wolves. at our cabin. And let me tell you, when you're at your rustic cabin that has no electricity, no running water, and you're there in bed with your husband, your dog, and your cat, and the lights are out, the lanterns are blown out, and you hear a loon, it's cool. And then when you hear a wolf.
Very close.
Yeah, and the dog sits up in bed, and the cat sits up in bed, and you sit up in bed. It is just really, really nice. And then we discovered that particular pack was called the Cedar Lake Pack. And a friend from the DNR gave me a paw print, an imprint. It's a pack of black wolves. And let me tell you, that wolf paw is that big. It's huge. So to answer your question, and I've gone on and on, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm doing another Northwoods in Wisconsin. It'll be a nice break from this, but because I've lived with Achsa for so long, but she will still stay with me for a long time, I'm sure. Anything else? I hope you'll come to the History Expo. I'll probably read a different part of the book, but did you think that that worked? I never know what to read to an audience, and I have 4 different examples from different chapters. It's not like reading a novel, you know, you just start a chapter but this one I thought was very poignant.
Now, the information about her eye and her behavior.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
And that was in a letter, or?
That was written about her, that was in letters, yes, that her eye protruded and it was very bad, very horrific.
Was it her whole life, or was it later?
It was just her illness that she had when she was visiting Oswego, and she had to spend the winter at John Crawford's home, and his wife had to go to Milwaukee because their daughter was having a baby. So she was cared for by a nurse and by him, and she had probably meningitis, and they shaved her head, and her eye began to protrude in a very ugly manner, and she acted in a peculiar way. She was hyperactive, and there's a psychological, I don't even have a copy of the book with me. I researched what she might have been suffering from, and it might have been a form of temporal lobe epilepsy, where they have moments of religious fervor and visions and act in that kind of manner where she just wrote for 24, 48 hours and dictated. Someone would write down what she said.
Yeah, according to Goddard, she wrote this 300-line play in verse in 72 hours.
Yeah.
Just in a fever.
Yeah.
It sounds like bipolar.
Sounds like
almost.
mania.
Yeah, really.
Like,
I think she had.
Or ghosts,
Thank
could have been ghosts.
Well, they didn't diagnose things
No.
like that. They put leeches on your body. They made all these nostrums, and you're supposed to drink them, and they tasted horrible.
It would be amazing if she had meningitis and recovered, because really nobody did.
Well, yes, but the first
Those
illness
days.
was rheumatoid arthritis, the scrofulous thing. Yes, in the end they called it brain fever,
Yeah,
and that was what she died of. No one would.
and people really didn't.
No.
Mark Twain's daughter died of it.
Oh, is that right?
I
Oh.
think
I
it
can't
was Jane.
imagine if she was that sick and that thin that she was really pregnant.
Oh, she wasn't. She was her imagination.
So I thought.
That part I made up. That was the fiction part, the historical fiction part.
How old was she when she died?
34.
Oh my gosh.
She was only 34, yeah.
But she never married, right?
No, she never married, no.
But she had the one sister?
Oh, no, she was from a family of 8. She had a sister, Orvilla, who married Jarius Jocelyn, and he was an older man, a widower, who had several children and lived in Tyson Furnace. And Jarius Jocelyn's great something,
Nephew, maybe?
yeah, I don't know what he is, has been in touch.
He came to the event in Plymouth.
Yes, and
On Sunday.
he sent me a bunch of photographs of Jarius and Jarius's descendants who had nothing to do with Achsa Sprague, but because they weren't even related to Orvilla, but he's coming.
He wanted to make a connection.
I know, yeah. He wanted to make a connection, and he's coming to the History Expo. He's very excited. He said Achsa would have bought lots of copies and given them out to all of her friends. She would have been so proud. And I thought, well, I'm going to believe that. Whether it's true or not, that's very nice to hear. So, then she had a sister, Malvina, who was not right. She was probably learning disabled and maybe had epilepsy because she had fits. And then she had a brother, I'm going to stop forgetting these names. She had a brother whose grave I stood at just yesterday, who was very slow, developmentally disabled, and she tried to teach him to read, and he did learn to read and to write, but her father said it was a waste of time. Her father was an alcoholic. He was not a happy alcoholic. He was a cruel man, and everybody thought her mother was a saint for living with him. She had two brothers. One of them died of dysentery. No, not dysentery. It was, what was it? They went up to Boston, and dysentery is diarrhea.
Diphtheria?
No, that other thing that they had.
Cholera?
I'm sorry, it's horrible to get old and not being able to think of words. Well, you know, that thing that they all got with the cough and the...
TB.
What?
Consumption.
Consumption.
Just tuberculosis.
Consumption, yes, he died of consumption. The two brothers went off to Boston to make a life for living for themselves. And the healthier brother brought the other one home, and he died of consumption. The healthier brother moved to Western Vermont and had a perfectly normal life. I'm sorry. You must know what it's like to have a word that doesn't come out. I'm going to do it in front of an audience.
No, no problem.
Thank you.
It's almost like charades.
Yes, it is. It sounds like, as this many syllables. My book club does it all the time with titles. Oh, don't you remember that book we read? Who was hosting that time?
Yeah.
And she served. You can always remember what we ate.
It's somehow reassuring, though. that
No.
they're doing it.
Yes, I know. Yeah, we all get all together.
Where are you speaking next? Could you?
I'll be at the History Expo on Saturday.
Where is that?
Tunbridge?
In Tunbridge.
The Tunbridge Fairgrounds?
This Saturday.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And Sunday I'll be there signing books after my talk at the Spiritualist Church of something in Healing. Yes, in Heartland.
Your presentation on Saturday is at 1 o'clock.
Yes, it is,
And
1
I think
o'clock
the-
Saturday.
I think the book signing on Sunday is also at 1 o'clock.
Yes, that's right.
Is that in Heartland or in?
No, it's in Tunbridge.
Oh.
They have a fairgrounds there where the
Yeah.
Historical Society
The
does
World's
this every other year. Why is it called the World's Fair?
It was a joke.
Oh,
It emerged, somebody just jokingly, back in the day, 100 or so years ago, referred to it as a World's Fair. And
because
they
I couldn't
appropriated it
remember
and stuff.
when Vermont hosted a World's Fair.
Every year.
Every year.
The oldest, I think, in the country or something, isn't it?
It's every other year.
No, that's the expo.
Oh,
But the Tunbridge World's Fair, yeah, it's going on for,
Over 140 years.
Yeah.
Is it the oldest in the country or? Could
I
be.
thought Topsfield in Massachusetts was the oldest.
It could be.
Next to the oldest.
We just don't want to hear about it.
Well, Topsfield brags and it's really Tunbridge.
But it's not a World's Fair, is it?
No, it's an agricultural.
There you go.
Yes.
the Vermont History Expo is an event put on by the Vermont Historical Society. Used to be every year, now it's every other year at the Tunbridge Fairgrounds. And in addition to all sorts of exhibits and music and games and things, the focal point is local historical societies from around the state bringing their own exhibits, their own displays. So Norwich is going to be there. The theme this year is water. So societies are supposed to have built their exhibits around some water theme. And there's, 120 societies exhibiting.
Oh, wow. That's going to be fun.
Yeah, and there's neat things like the Vermont Morgan Horse Association will have Morgan horses and they will be driving them. You know, the Morgan horse is the state animal of Vermont, and the breed started here in
Yes.
Vermont. So
One of the books I
Starting
had
with
as a
stuff.
child was called Justin Morgan Had a Horse.
Yes.
And I don't know why
Henry.
I ended up with that book as a child for some reason. I guess all little girls like horses, but I probably still have it.
That was also Woodstock.
It was.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, and there's a big sign up in Woodstock. I used to work in Woodstock for years. I lived up there. There's a difference, I think, Sarah, between tolerance or even acceptance and really embracing a vision. Are you one with this woman that you studied? I mean, do you really believe her mission? You believe in it, don't you? I sense it in you.
I've lived with her for almost 20 years.
I know that, 18, 19 years.
Yeah, and I figured if she did not want this book done, she would have hampered my work in some ways.
Did you find yourself talking to her?
Oh my God, all the time,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
And, for example, she's given signs, physical signs,
Yeah, I wondered.
that she's been around, yes.
Could you tell us about one of those?
Well, sure. One year I was living in Milwaukee and I was going to have my spring pelvic exam, which you changed to physical or something, and the editor, no, maybe my son
Yeah, I
did.
don't think it was me.
This was a blog I wrote, okay. And I never wrote to you about this. Anyway, I said to her, she said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm searching, oh, this is the whole diary thing. Well, that's part of a thing too. I was looking for the original diaries because the diaries that were given to the Vermont Historical Society, which were published in the proceedings in September and December of 1941 by a man named Leo Twinham, disappeared after they were used for the proceedings. And he had had them typed up and put ellipses in there and had taken stuff out. He was a Presbyterian minister who then became defrocked. And I did a whole year's worth of research into him because I wanted to find out what happened to those diaries. I'm shortening this story. And never found them, never found them, never found them. Because I wanted to know what he'd taken out because I thought maybe it was really good stuff. And 3 years ago they appeared on eBay.
No.
How did that happen?
Beats.
I
I had looked everywhere. I checked with every antiquarian society, every college, every university, every historical society, every place. Sharon, Connecticut is where he was from. I researched the historical society there. They said he was an old eccentric who brought in odds and ends of weird stuff. And I said, well, but if these were before email. They said he never had any diaries, never mentioned Achsa Sprague. I even wrote to the woman at whose home his widow died in her mother's arms, in this girl's arms. She said her mother left a trunk full of stuff, but there were no diaries. And I even got the woman's will. I went to the ends of the earth searching for these diaries, and then they appeared on eBay, and the seller said he bought them at an auction in New York. And so Paul Carnahan, the librarian at Vermont Historical Society, and I wanted to know, well, we had both bid on them in eBay. They went for $5,000. And so Paul,
Sounds like a bargain.
well, now they'll be worth a lot more. So
Yeah,
Paul
after your book.
at least wrote to the guy who sold them and said, could you forward my email to the person who bought it so that we could maybe just have a look at them or find out why he's interested in them. And I wanted to see the unabridged versions. We never heard back. And when the book was about to come out, I asked Paul, I said, please send the guy another email, and he did. We still have not heard a thing. So I have no idea where they are.
It's foolish because they're going to be a lot more valuable
I
as a
know.
result of your book.
I know. Maybe they, I
This is
have
so
no idea.
foolish.
Well, the thing about the pelvic exam, okay, I went to this woman who was you're laughing, I know. But you know, those
No,
were,
I'm not laughing.
okay.
No, I'm not
You know,
laughing.
you have
I
a
think it's
lapse
great.
here every year. I was
Not at
being
all.
really, really particular, and this woman was a nurse practitioner. She said, well, I have a friend who's a psychic, and I'm gonna get in touch with her and see what she thinks. Well, she went home that day from work, and the woman was the psychic, was on the phone. She was a rural mail carrier from Eau Claire, which is way up in the northwestern part of Wisconsin. So she told the rural mail carrier story about Twinham and the diaries, and the rural mail carrier had this vision. And she said, I see this number, thus and such. I've got this up in the car, darn it. And red brick building, 3 steps leading up to it, a lot of bookshelves. So, and that's where the diaries are. So I sent this to Paul, And he and my work-study student, Caroline Mercurio, went to this red brick building, which was used as a warehouse for old stuff from the Historical Society. And the number that this woman had said was so important to her was the telephone exchange for that time. And they went inside, and they went downstairs, and books fell off a bookshelf.
When they happened to be there.
When they were there,
Yeah.
when they came into the room, and they were the published versions of the diaries.
Yep.
That were the proceedings.
Yeah, I was talking to you.
I was doing an interview with Vermont Public Radio this spring, and I was doing it from home on our landline, and I was in my study with the doors closed so the cats and the dog couldn't get in. And I heard something behind me fall while I was on the phone talking to the woman interviewing me, and I thought, well, that's strange, because I haven't been in that part of the room for a long time. And when I was done with it, I looked over there, and my knitting basket had toppled over into the box of Achsa Sprague books. So she was obviously in the room with me while I was doing. I mean, I say that. I guess I do believe it.
And I think you should be unafraid to tell people those stories.
Well, I'm telling you.
And you stick to it. Stick to it.
I'm not ashamed of it. I do think that there is a... My husband's former wife died before I met him. They had been painting their living room, and she went down the basement and did not come back upstairs. She'd had a heart attack. And it was a tremendous jolt for him. And a week or so later, she appeared to him at night in the doorway. And he spoke with her. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes, I'm fine. I just came back to tell you that everything's all right." And he said, "Will you come back again?" And she said, "It depends upon the permitter." And right? And then she went away. And we've heard other stories like that too, of people who've had a loss in their family and they've been visited by the one who's gone. Yes.
You should tell about at Lilydale when
Oh, and then, yes. And then Del went with me to Lilydale one year. And I took this personal development of mediumship from Rose Clifford and learned how to rub my hands together and how to meditate and so forth. And I signed Del up for a reading with her because she seemed legit. There are some people who call themselves mediums and they just do it because they have intuition or because they want to fleece people. I'm very, very strict about that. She seemed very real. And so I got Del an appointment for a reading with her because I thought, this will prove to him that this really works. So I don't know what all she told him in a half an hour. But at the end, she said, "Oh, and by the way, Joe says to tell you hello." Now, how did she know that Del's wife was named Joe, that he called her Joe? Her name was Joanne.
Yeah, the Dana House, the Historical Society in Woodstock, Alan, the Dana House has a stairway where a number of people saw spirits and the spirits talked to them. The next time you go up in, the Dana House.
I think Dana is mentioned in the book.
Yeah, and there's a, by the way, a photograph. When you go through that Historical Society. I think it's just a fascinating topic.
Yes, well, thank you.
Fascinating.
Well, that's what I thought too, so that's why I pursued it.
For 20 years.
I know, well, I get other books in between, but yes.
When you went to Lilydale, did you stay there? Or
Yes, we stayed in the Leolin Hotel, which had
What is the name of the
Leolin.
Leolin.
And my husband and I were in this room, and this one night I couldn't sleep. They were moving furniture back and forth upstairs in the room above us, and it was so noisy. And the next morning, the woman at the desk said, "Did you have a good night?" I said, "No." They kept moving furniture above in this room, I'm pushing dressers around, something really heavy. She said, "There's nothing upstairs. We had a fire there. It's completely empty. It's just all charred. There's nothing there at all." Well, it was weird. So,
This is the third time that Lilydale has come into my...
you better get there.
Yeah.
I think you're meant to
Next
go.
trip.
I don't know where I saw it first, I saw it second because I found the papers with a little note
Yeah.
that said Louis Dale, and then I looked it up on the
Yeah.
internet. And then I looked at it, and it was interesting, and maybe, I don't know, and how it's come up.
Yeah, it's worth a visit.